Let's go ahead and jump right into it and look at where we left off. We were finishing up the 1600s, and we approached the 1700s with some big changes are afoot. And we look at this, we look at the continuing role and the dominance of the French. And that dominance is not going to come cheaply, because we know that Louis XIV, and I'm old enough to recall this, that he used to be Louis the Great. When I was studying European history, the French adored Louis XIV. And they talked about everything great that is French, emulated from the Sun King. That has since changed, because I'm old enough to remember that I studied French here at this high school along with Russian, because French was the language of international diplomacy. It no longer is. It's been replaced by English. It's not considered the international language anymore, and the French have really kind of, I think that the sun has set on the French for the most part, and the French today think of Louis XIV much differently. They look at him as sort of the catalyst of the French Revolution, and that's really what we want to be thinking about. Is that yes, we can talk about the splendor of Versailles, the wonders of the whole French court life, but we have to contrast that with the realities of Versailles, and the realities that it's more of a political vehicle, but it's not really as bad as we think. In other words, remember, don't be pulled into the court costs and thinking that's what's going to break the French bank. Louis's obsession with war is going to be his undoing. His real Achilles heel is going to be his inability to, first of all, achieve anything decisive on the battlefield, and then also be completely caught up into it. And we talk about that with his 4 wars, and his 4th and final war being the big one, being the War of Spanish Succession, which is going to be fought from 1701 to 1713, 1714, depending on when you want to get to the Peace of Utrecht. And that really brings about the end of his reign, because he's on his deathbed at the time that Utrecht is being negotiated. He died in August of that year. But Louis is very, very large in French history, but the end result is probably kind of negative. If you recall, in the War of Spanish Succession, that was the most costly of all his 4 wars. It was also the most dynamic. It was the most worthwhile to really look into, but it didn't have the kind of result that he wanted. He did get his grandson Philip on the Spanish throne. And so his statement that he made, "The Pyrenees exist no more," were relatively accurate. And there was a fact that Utrecht said that the thrones would not be united, but we still have Louis's grandson on the Spanish throne. To what real extent does that affect anything? Well, the Spanish are no longer real major players in Europe anyway, and Spain is a very isolated country doing its own thing. So it's not as impacting as Louis probably had hoped. What is, however, is the concessions that Louis had to give to acquire the Spanish throne for his grandson. That is something worth at least considering, and that's going to be the all-important placement of the British in Newfoundland and achieve port status at the headwaters of Hudson Bay. So strategically, I think that the British came out pretty nicely at Utrecht, and it kind of sets the stage for what's going to be the ascendancy of the British Royal Crown. And France will remain a continental power in Europe, and now stock for the British is going to go way up. Louis dies and passes it on to his eldest grandson, which is Louis XV, who I really didn't talk about at all, because he just continued the practices of Louis XIV, spent more money at court, and really didn't do much at all. He's not a very remarkable king. Now, Louis XVI, there's a lot more to talk about. So that takes us into France. I want to talk briefly about the Russians, because this is kind of the time of their movement from the backwaters of Europe to real major players having a seat at the table in the balance of power. And that is entirely due to the role of Peter I. Peter had a very interesting life. He was a king with his, he was Tsar with his sister. And she was extraordinarily bright. She was an older sister, and she looked like she was really the brains of the country for some time, until Peter came of age and he decided that his sister was going to be a problem, and he had her removed and put into a convent, where she she would spend the rest of her life. That's kind of how it worked over there. As you know, as we talked about in the last lecture, he spent some time in the 1600s over in the Dutch Netherlands. He became very enamored with the West, and this is not an okay thing for Russians to be enamored with the West. And that gets back to this whole idea of the Russian Orthodox Church and the idea that the Russian Orthodoxy is that last pure Christian faith on earth. So remember going through this that it was believed by the Russians that Rome fell in 476, the Western Roman Catholic world was already corrupt and had fallen. Constantinople, the Byzantine culture, fell in 1453, and that's when, post-1453, we began seeing the Russians accept the title of Moscow being the third Rome. Peter is loved, Peter is hated. He's loved today as a lasting legacy, but in his time he was hated because, led by the old believers and a lot of Orthodox Russians, they believed that this guy, in fact, was poisoned by his time in the West, that he had been completely corrupted, and that he was, to some, the Antichrist, because the prophecy of the Revelation is that when the third kingdom of God happens and it falls, it's the end for everybody. So, if you're doing your math correctly, Rome was considered the first. It had fallen in 476. Constantinople fell in 1453, and here comes this guy who's been over to the Netherlands, and suddenly now he is removing Moscow as the capital of Russia and building a new city and naming it after himself and making it the capital, and that was just considered to be the work of the devil. So that's the at least that was the ecclesiastic perspective of Peter. He did not get along well with some members of the Orthodox Church for obvious reasons. However, just about everybody else realized this thought was very, very powerful, and that he was going to, with his own will and all of his own energy, he was going to make Russia a modern country. And he did so by not only building a pretty remarkable capital, mostly Baroque architectured capital, and far, far north. By the way, for us, it's parallel with Anchorage, Alaska. Built a navy, modernized the army by getting French advisors, and ultimately having the humiliation of being defeated soundly by the Swedes early on. At a place called Narva, he actually hires French military advisors. They come in, they revamp his army, and then he achieves a stunning success at Poltava. Effectively does exactly what he wanted to in his foreign policy, which is drive the Swedes off of the European continent and really make them a second-rate power in Europe, and then also provide himself with an avenue of trade and access, a window to the west, by opening the Baltic and reducing, Swedish naval threat on the Baltic. So that's what he did militarily. Socially, probably the biggest piece. The Russians will become Europeanized. They'll be required to shave their faces and not wear long beards. They'll be required to wear Western dress. Importation of ballet, classical music, lots of money spent on building a massive art collection. And so there is this full embracing of European culture, European highbrow culture that will be enjoyed not just by Russian aristocracy, but by all the citizens of this new city of St. Petersburg. So he kind of put Russia on the map. And so he is still regarded today by the Russians as Peter the Great. Very, very fondly regarded by the Russians as one of the probably their greatest political leader. It fits that it's running right into the Enlightenment, and I realize there's another person. If we're going to talk about these two, and we're going to talk about the Enlightenment, we're going to add Frederick the Great. Okay, so we've firmly established the ascension of the French Bourbon. We've also brought in, we've firmly established the ascension of the French Bourbon. We've also brought in the Spanish Bourbon, and now we have the Romanov family with Peter, and now we have what I would say is really the poster child of the Enlightenment would be Frederick the Great, Frederick II of Prussia. And he's a great poster child because he's an extraordinary, he's not even well-rounded. This guy's really good at everything. I mean, just about everything this guy did, he didn't just, dabble in something. I mean, he pressed himself, he pushed himself very hard. This guy is a legitimate composer. Several concertos, I think 2 symphonies. In his own right, could have easily been, definitely his own, would have made a statement in the Baroque period as a legitimate artist. But also as a painter. Some of his work is quite good. And strangely enough, for as much as he is on the arts side, he's the first king that we know of that called himself the first servant of the state. He humbled himself before his people. He also is considered the finest military commander of the 1700s. Of course, I can't include Bonaparte yet, because he really won't be in there until late 1700s and early 1800s. So that's a lot. He embodies the very, very best of what Voltaire said was the enlightened despot. The person who is capable of being despotic, making those tough political decisions, not trying to be buddy-buddy with everybody, but coming down hard when it needs to be done, but also has the great capacity to do good for his country. And that comes with a classical education, to be able to speak in tongues and understand many languages, to have an affinity for the finer things in life and culture and what is, what we would consider to be overall what's best for an entire country. So he embodies all of that, and he does it with a country that's also on the rise. Prussia is definitely on the rise in the 1700s thanks to Frederick. Small, definitely, but his armies are really tenacious and very, very disciplined, and a lot of times that's kind of the story of the 1700s. Warfare was kind of formal, and it wasn't real bloody. Certainly, when we look at what happened in the Americas in what we call the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, versus what's happening in Europe in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, you have a night and day contrast. You wanted to be deployed in one of those European armies. You didn't want to be on the Canadian-U.S. border. You didn't want to be fighting up in New York or around Lake Erie. You didn't want to be the nasty battles that the colonials were in. Instead, you wanted to be, shining all your uniform up and riding your beautiful horse onto the field and having your opponent, just remark at how extraordinary you looked, and the officers ride out in the middle of the field and have some tea, and they end up solving the thing. You never even have to go fight. That was much, much more desirable. So, these things are awful. I really don't like talking about it, although I really, really find economic history to be interesting. This is a pretty easy lesson, but also one that I think kind of gets maybe a little bit overblown. You can expect to probably see some mention on this in the multiple choice component. I doubt very much if we're going to get into a lot of economic history in the 1700s. If they're going to do anything with that, it's probably going to be down here with the diplomatic revolution, as they like to toy with people and see if you can get completely confused. And we'll try to take care of that. First, the bubbles. The bubbles are basically the idea that we've had, and this should certainly resonate with you guys because we talked about the housing bubble of 2008. Prior to that, we really had to teach about something like this as an abstract concept, but basically the idea that things became overvalued. And there was a great deal of enthusiasm. There was a great deal of wanting to jump in because you would see immediate returns on stocks. And we're talking about the Mississippi Company in France. And we're talking about the Joint Stock Company in Great Britain and the South Sea Company. And both these companies, I mean, it probably was a very extraordinarily exciting time because you would see your stock double very quickly. And when that happens, of course, your immediate thought is, I need to buy more stock. I want to buy more. I want to keep getting in. And ultimately, it inflated like a bubble. And when the bubble burst, the people who were responsible for it, especially on the French side, a guy named John Law, who was kind of a loan shark financier, he disappears into the woodwork. He's gone, and the French royalty is left holding the bag. In Great Britain, it was different. And this is a lesson I'm absolutely certain will bag. In Great Britain, it was different. And this is a lesson I'm absolutely certain will not be followed today because fiscal responsibility, let's be honest, is not something that countries want to go through because it's a long, painful road to get out of big debt. But hats off to the British because the British did accept their debt as public debt, and they began to go through periods of austerity where they worked their way out of debt. And we see the British, even today, we know that the British pound sterling is the strongest currency in Europe. And it is still considered today to be kind of the benchmark currency because they still back their currency with actual specie, which we haven't in so long. But this mindset in Great Britain that goes all the way back to the 1720s where they said, yeah, we screwed up and we have to dig ourselves out of this hole. And they did, and they pulled it off. Now, it's also pretty handy that they started to really open up markets overseas, and they had other successful ventures to go with it. For the French, unfortunately, and again, I'm kind of foreshadowing here, but we're kind of building on this whole time of bubbles as a way of adding to the economic misery that's going into the French economy. And that's, of course, a big problem. You've got the lavish spending of Louis XIV going away from the example of the original Bourbon of Henry IV and having a surplus in the treasury. Now you're looking at deepening debt, and it's all being basically shoved right into the national debt. And so there's not a sense of shared responsibility for that debt, and that debt's going to go unwarranted, and then it's going to be impossible to move by 1787. Okay, the diplomatic revolution is, I think, what in Palmer they talked about the reversal of alliances, and it's just a time when I think the easiest way to do this and the easiest way to sort this out is to keep in mind balance of power. If you're thinking like a good Englishman and you're thinking balance of power, things start to change when you add different variables to the balance of power. Here's the old school thought. The French are the biggest power in Europe. They have been since Richelieu and the end of the 30 Years' War. That would be Westphalia in 1648. The French have been the problem. We have verified this problem by Louis XIV and his 4 wars, basically acting unilaterally and trying to gobble up more and more of Europe, and then everybody kind of jumping in there, including, of course, William of Orange III and the British and the Prussians, and everybody trying to keep the French from eating too much of Europe. So that was the way things were. Now, the Austrians have gotten a little more powerful, and so they factor into this, and the new boy on the block, which is the Prussians, and we also have to think about the Russians. So you've got a change in the 17th century where there's this shifting dynamic, which is going to happen again in the 1800s after Germany is unified, which they'll never really recover from. But the idea being is that the balance of power is now shifting. There are more major actors into it. And what is the role of Prussia? What is the role? Break away from one another. And you start to think about things with the balance of power. Always have the problem in the south, which is the Ottoman Turk, always threatening. And, is it possible to see the French and the Austrians ever get together? And in this period, yes. And the reason is because there's going to be marriage into the House of Hanover, and the Prussians and the English are going to find a commonality. And this is during the 7 Years' War, which we in this part of the world call the French and Indian War. And you start to see things start to happen. This diplomatic revolution is basically a whole new way of looking at an alliance and commonality for achieving foreign policy. But it's still directed around the balance of power. So for brief intervals, now I'm talking about very, very brief, leading up to the 7 Years' War of 1756, from about the 1730s to about 1756, we see this really difficult and complicated mixture of the Austrians and the French suddenly now acting to affect that, and then everybody wondering what the Russians are going to do, and if they're all at all to be considered because they're so large. And what about the Turk? As the Turk is now kind of on the decline, what's going to play out in Southern Europe? So that's what the diplomatic revolution is all about. And the British being at the center point and being the real point of collision on the European battlefield. And that's going to be obviously played out extensively here in North America, but also on the battlefields of Prussia and Austria. And we have the War of Austrian Succession, the War of Pragmatic Sanction, and we have some other ones like that. So that's all occurring during this period called the Diplomatic Revolution. Meanwhile, while that's going on, we have in the social and economic realm probably the biggest transformation over European history in terms of its economic potential. Obviously, today we're considered to be in post-industrial time. But recall, please, that if you're going to look at the Industrial Revolution, you're looking at about 1750 to 1900. okay? So you're looking at about 150 years of European history. I'm not talking yet about the American Industrial Revolution. That's going to be the Second Industrial Revolution. That's a little bit later. That's going to be, you know, late 1800s into the 1900s. But for Europe, it's 1750 to 1900. England is going to be the leader of this thing, and it requires agricultural reform first. Remember that an industrial revolution is not some kind of spontaneous little sprout popping out of the ground. A couple of conditions created the right mechanisms for the Industrial Revolution. And of course the big thing is technology going into the countryside, which replaces the peasant. And this is a huge piece of social history because if you think about how far do you want to go back? How far do you want to go back? Certainly if you get into medieval times. I mean, the peasant is the centerpiece for labor throughout all of antiquity. Whether it's the peasant, or we go back into Roman times and it's the slaves and the peasants. It still is because we have mechanization occurring on the farm. These labor-saving devices are replacing peasants who have been who knows how long, you know, peasants for 40 generations. And now, you know, what are you going to do with your powerful resume of a strong back and a weak mind? You're going to have to go to the cities. You're going to crowd into the cities with your 9 or 15 kids, and you're going to look for work. Perfect for the factories. The factory owner has to know that they have to dumb down the work so simply that they're not going to be artisans, they're not going to be skilled craftsmen. The guild system is going to wither on the vine and die because these factories are going to have almost completely unskilled workers that are going to work extraordinarily hard for extraordinarily low amounts of money, and there's going to be a very significant. Well, we're going to be talking about this is the time of Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, the Manchester School, and the whole growth of capitalism and the explosion of markets. So you've got market economic theory, you've got capitalism at its earliest stages, you've got exploitation of the working class, and then eventually the ideas of Marx will come from that and try to bridge that gap between the worker, the factory worker, and the factory owner, and try to improve conditions for the factory worker, which will eventually happen. So, you know that I'm not a huge fan about going into huge long lectures about this stuff, but I do think it's extraordinarily important that you understand it, that you get it from the big picture idea, and you know, I just don't think that they're going to ask you to really articulate anything about Richard Arkwright's water frame, and I could be completely wrong about that. You never know what kind of random crap they're going to pull out, but they did have. One year they wanted an essay, and they were asking about the bare-breasted women who worked in the coal mines. That caught me by surprise. I didn't see that one coming. But I guess they did. I guess the girls worked with their shirts off because it's hot down there. So you never know. The movement itself is extraordinarily important, but the details of it, I think you probably have a pretty good base, and I'm not going to exploit that a whole lot more. Okay. So this brings us through what I would call the teeth of the 1700s, and we get to that big event called the French Revolution in 1789. Let's back up to 1787 and talk about the events that bring us up to the French Revolution so that we can kind of articulate an idea and a vision about really having a grasp of the French Revolution is not, again, just some event that just occurred in a random order. There is a degree to which I think revolution may be overcooked and overstudied order. There is a degree to which I think revolution may be overcooked and overstudied, that reality that a few things will cause this thing to go from a period of possible discontent to a complete upheaval. First things first. Yes, the American Revolution occurs in 1776, and the American Revolution is a lot more enlightened than the French Revolution is. And it's a good do that. Certainly there's room for you to comment that knowing that the American Revolution came first, knowing that the American Revolution embodied the philosophy of the French salons while the French were talking about doing these extraordinary things like representative government and separation of powers and the idea of unalienable, bringing American history into European history at this time and making that leap. Very, very important. But the reason that we study the French Revolution is not just because it's Europe. That's going to be the power brokers in Europe. That, in essence, puts it in a little bit of a different light than the American Revolution. That's right, back up and say, well, the American Revolution is awesome. I love talking about it philosophically, but let's be honest, it's a colonial revolt. It's a colonial revolt. This is much bigger than a colonial revolt. This is being set on its ear from within by the middle class, which has never happened before. So that to me is the big backdrop as to why. That's the why the French Revolution is a big deal. That's the why they love to pick on this topic on the AP exam. Because if you don't have that big understanding of the French Revolution and why it's a larger event, well, you know what? Yeah, there were some crop failures. Yeah, there were some economic problems. Yes, they even were smart enough to hire the Swiss to come in and tell them what their economic problems were. And their economic problems were basically the fact that they needed to tax the clergy. That's poo-poo. They're not going to do that. And they should also consider taxing the nobility. And that's poo-poo, and they're not going to do that. So they're going to send us all the Swiss guys, go back home, go back up your little mountain, and go back to Geneva and eat chocolate and fondue and leave us alone. Fine. We know that the droughts of 1787 and first part of 1788 did exacerbate the problem because when you have drought, you have food shortage. When you have food shortage, you have inflation. When you have inflation, your economy begins to tank. People start losing discretionary income. Now people start losing more and more jobs. Unemployment's going up. At the same time, things are becoming more and more expensive because of supply and demand. And who's the big loser? Well, everybody's the big loser, but also the big loser is the government because they're not getting revenue. So the king wants revenue, and the king in 1789 doesn't get that he is going to be squeezing blood out of turnip. He's not. They don't have anything. The revenue is not there. But Louis XVI wants revenue. He wants it badly, and he's going to do it the old way, the way that it's been done in the past, but yet hasn't been done in the last 150 years. That's because of basically Louis XIV and Louis XV. Because basically the only way to raise money is to bring all the people together, bring the Estates General together, and squeeze the third estate. Remember, each estate has one vote. If one estate is the clergy, they're tax exempt. One estate is a nobility, they're tax exempt. Of course they're going to be okay authorizing an increase in revenue. The third estate of 1789 is not the third estate of 150 years prior. People, you've got doctors, you've got lawyers, you've got engineers, you've got college professors, you've got people with formal education, and they're not dumb, dirt on their fingernails peasants. These people are shrewd, they're smart, they're true bourgeoisie. They have money, yeah, they're new money. They've traveled, they're worldly. They are very, very, very involved in a lot of things, and they're not going to take what the king wanted to do, which railroad them right into a big tax increase. And to be honest with you, the bourgeoisie probably had the money, but certainly the peasants did not. And that was going to be extraordinarily unrealistic. So, okay, so the Estates General obviously never happened. They were smart enough to know that if the third estate actually did meet in the opera house of Versailles, if they actually pulled that off and met, they knew that they would pretty much be toast. That they wouldn't be able to get anything other than just being railroaded in a tax increase, and you guys can all go home now. So instead, they start their own assembly, representing 98% of the population. They see themselves as a more accurate assembly, and members of the first and second estate were invited to join. By the way, some did join. They didn't all turn around and walk out. Most of them did. But there were some members of the clergy and some members of the nobility that actually did join the National Assembly when they took the tennis court oath, which arguably is the real beginning of the French Revolution, because standing up in an absolute monarchy and saying you're going to write a constitution is probably more revolutionary than going for a bunch of food, which they did at the Bastille in July of that year. But French are a little bit touchy about that, so we'll let them have their Bastille Day, and they can all say they all had Rousseau under one arm while they were looting the food. So we know it's very unique in that it's the only revolution that is bourgeois-led, but also it says something to Louis XVI and really the difference between Louis XVI and Louis XIV. Now you think about it. What if Louis XIV was in the helm of France in 1789, and he hears word that a bunch of members are on a tennis court and they're deciding to write a constitution? think you have a fire on the tennis court and you start over. That's going to not last. But Louis XVI, he authorizes and makes this a valid organization when he orders the first and second estate to join, because, quite frankly, he's John II in 1215, just like Magna Carta. I don't care how you get my money, just go get my money. Go get my money. We haven't met in 150 years. Nobody knows really what this Estates General is all about. Anyway, just go get the money. And that was a little bit short-sighted, because making a National Assembly legitimate helped them work on their constitution. And that's when Louis XVI decided he needed to show him who's boss. And that's when he's going to order 12,000 soldiers out of the garrison of the Bastille in July of 1789. And I imagine that probably when all those starving people in Paris watched 12,000 men march out, there was food. Well, the rest is pretty simple deduction. Hey, the food's unguarded. Let's go get some food.
6.
Yeah, 7. Yeah, 7. 3 were so criminally insane they went back in their cells and shut the door. So they released 4 prisoners. So we could put Rousseau under one arm and say they did something very, very enlightened. They released political prisoners, but only 4. So, but they did get a lot of food. They got a lot of gunpowder. They got a lot of muskets, and well, that I don't know how it worked out for them, but certainly that was it's a little bit odd when the French celebrating Bastille Day. So, after that happened, the first actual act of violence. And by the way, I'm still having trouble with that whole Bastille Day being enlightened, because it seems like Baltimore this week, and thinking about the mayor with his head on a pike being paraded through the streets and complete chaos everywhere. I just don't see it as like how you're saying that's enlightened. But at least in that one, the police joined with the rioters and stole food too. So the revolution goes on, but the French Revolution takes several interesting turns, and probably the most important one being the one with Robespierre. But prior to that, let's at least talk about the fact that the National Assembly actually did what it was intending to do. It took them a while, but they got the law of August 4th, they got the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, and then ultimately the Constitution of 1791. Now it helps when you have a guy like Thomas Jefferson as the ambassador to France, sitting there with a copy of the Declaration of Independence on it. That probably didn't hurt things. It probably helped them speed their document on for the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which is strikingly a lot like the American Declaration of Independence and the English Bill of Rights. So they get some documents passed, and once they do that, of course, they've written this wonderful Constitution, except it's pretty much worthless, because the king won't sign it. So what do they really have? What do they really achieve? From 1789 to 1791, they've achieved a lot of paper. They've generated a lot of paper. They look kind of like the UN today. They've generated a lot of paper and not a lot of action. But they will get action, and they'll get action because ultimately, as things start to deteriorate and the popularity of the royal family starts to deteriorate, the royal family decides they're going to sneak out. Nabbed on the border by a quick-thinking, nimble postmaster, and being brought back to Paris to be put under arrest and shoved into, I'm sure, horrible quarters, which today is the Louvre. That was the old palace. They couldn't go back to Versailles. They were going to be in Paris under the thumb of the people, where they're going to be watched carefully, and where they'll go on and commit treason. And basically, the only way that he's going to keep his kingdom intact is to sign the Constitution of 1791. So he did, and he signed the Constitution, and it upset the Austrian royal family. Let's remember that these royal families are heavily inbred, and that Marie Antoinette is. Let's see, it's not going to be Joseph anymore. Joseph's dead, and it's going to be Ferdinand, is going to be the Emperor of Austria. His sister is being held against her will in Paris, so the situation between Austria and France continues to decline until finally the revolutionary government of France deciding, well, things are going so well in the revolution, let's just go ahead and declare war. So they declare war on the French in 1793, and the war is on. And it didn't go well at all for the French.
Wait, the revolutionary government declared war on Austria.
On Austria, right, in 1793. And that 1793 declaration of war was, some say short-sighted, but maybe that's what they needed to do. They needed something to galvanize the country and get them kind of, getting away from so many factions. By this time, the National Assembly, well, remember the National Assembly and that whole tennis court oath, that assembly had disbanded because they had fulfilled their oath, which was not to disband until they read the Constitution. So they had moved into the Jacobin Club of Paris, where they were now the Legislative Assembly, and the Legislative Assembly was, if you remember the diagram, they were sitting in that room where they had the right, which were the Royalists, they had the moderates in the middle with the mountain sitting on top of them, which were the Jacobins, and then they had the left, the ones who were liberals, or maybe so far left that you were J.P. Marat and sans-culotte, and you were willing to cut the king's head off and do all kinds of violent things and work outside of the law. Okay, so we have a pretty volatile political structure, but it is a political spectrum as we know it today with a pretty volatile political structure, but it is a political spectrum as we know it today with a right and a left, and I'm sure very, very dynamic moments happening for the Legislative Assembly through 1793. The country is at war. They're trying to determine a path of revolution. Some people want to restore the king. They would be on the far right of the room. Other people want to go with a full-blown republic, which would be on the far left of the room. And nobody's reaching a consensus until evidence comes in that the king is aiding and abetting the Austrians. That's probably not such a huge reach because he wanted to get back into power, and they were family. They, the Austrian royal family, were also family. So evidence was collected. Louis XVI was put on trial. Louis XVI pulled a Charles I of England and didn't realize that really he is, in fact, litigating for his life. Instead, he decides to lecture the court that they don't have any legitimacy and that he is the king of France and that you should basically all go to hell. And that didn't work out too well. They found him guilty. They took him to the guillotine at Place de la Concorde and committed regicide. They killed him. It was in January 1794. No, I got it myself. That was in 1793 also. Once that happened, once any government does this and kills the existing leader, one thing is for sure, there's no going back. And things have been bad. Things really turned bad because this is when you start to see the clergy saying, okay, look, enough is enough. The big loser up to this point in 1793 was clearly the Catholic Church. They had been taking a beating because they had lost their tithe. That had been abolished with the law of August 4th. That the church had lost all of their land holdings. And finally, you have a counter-revolution led by a refractory clergy. You also have a counter-revolution being led by various other groups who obviously are very much against the revolution, and finally the revolutionary government is going to declare what would be the equivalent of our complete martial law. They're going to give, who at that time, the man who is above reproach, the most honest man in France, Maximilien Robespierre, with basically powers of martial law. And he's going to form his Committee of Public Safety, and they are going to go about cleaning house. They're going to find those disloyal with the revolution. They are going to act swiftly. They are going to serve as police, judge, and executioner all at one time. The numbers, as you know, are grossly under-exaggerated. And recently they've gone down into the Paris catacombs, and they suddenly began carbon dating a lot of skulls. And the original figure of 40,000 people being lost in the Reign of Terror has been shattered now. Somewhere around 250,000. At least there's 250,000 skulls that have their bodies missing that are carbon dated to 1794. So if you do the math, I don't know, unless they had a lot of accidental injuries where people were decapitated in 1794 in addition to the Reign of Terror, it's likely the numbers are much, much higher than we had originally thought. So Robespierre obviously leads the Reign of Terror, and I want you to exercise caution with this because I lecture about this, and I almost don't want to talk about it because I want you to show restraint, only because I've spent many, many years with the folks who score the AP Euro exam, and I am definitely the black sheep there. I would say that all of the graders are mostly francophiles, mostly social historians, and they are enamored with the idea that Robespierre was this just an all-around bad guy, and there's absolute evil coming from Robespierre. However, I just have to say this. It worked. For as much as we hate the Reign of Terror, as much as we hate that whole trail of blood and all that terrible stuff, and all of the who knows how many thousands of people that were totally innocent, a hell of a lot of guilty people got it too. And so, guess what? When you look at the facts on the other side of the Reign of Terror, they're kind of all settled down. And the revolution, in other words, it did what it was intended to do. It restored order in the absolute worst way possible, but it really brought the revolution back on. Please be careful and don't articulate that too heavily on an essay. I just don't want you to, because they'll take it personally and they'll get all pissed off. It's a great essay. They're getting a 3. So careful. But it worked, and we know that. And we know that there happens to be this young Corsican whose star was hitched to Robespierre because he was in the right place at the right time, and he just happened to save the life of Robespierre's little brother. And of course, that is one Napoleon Bonaparte, and the place is called Rivoli, and that was kind of an interesting moment there where his brother is spared by Napoleon, and he writes a letter to his brother back in Paris talking about this extraordinary general, young Corsican general, at a time when nobody is having any success against the Austrians. And Napoleon's star is going to be hitched to Robespierre. And briefly, if you recall, Napoleon spent a brief interval in jail after Robespierre was finally taken to the guillotine and he was executed. Everybody connected to Robespierre spent some jail time, including Napoleon, but he was cleared as being never a part of the Reign of Terror. Okay, so we've established the end of the Reign of Terror. We've kind of turned things around with Austria, and now France is going to have a new government, and this government, the directory makes total sense. If you had a complete dictator, no matter how good a guy he was, Robespierre definitely was corrupted by the power that he had with the Committee of Public Safety and being a complete dictator of France. So, doesn't it sound logical that they're going to come back with a directory of 5 executives? They're going to take all that power, they're going to spread it amongst 5 individuals. That way you don't have one person becoming too powerful. Hint, hint. Yeah. And the idea being is that you're going to build a consensus government, but not an oligarchy. It's not so big that it's an oligarchy. It's going to be slow moving. It's going to be still pretty swift, but it's not going to have the one personality deciding all policy. So, and they figured, well, we've got 4 legitimate politicians. We need to have one guy from the military. Why not pick that kind of social buffoon who's a really good military guy, but not much of a politician? This guy named Bonaparte. So he'll be the 5th director and kind of the default. He's kind of the Joe Biden of the director. Hey, we'll call on you if there's a tie. Okay. Until then, let's just go beat up people in Egypt and do stuff like that. Shoot the nose off the Sphinx and go have some fun because we don't really want you around here. So that brings us to 1800. So why don't we hit pause? Why don't we go ahead? Well, I should bring the coup d'etat of Marin. Let's put him right in power. Let's put him to 1799. Bring him to power. Okay. Napoleon is in the directory. He is the 5th member of the directory, and they decided, well, let's use this guy. We've got some problems in Paris, and we need him to solve some problems. So let's just see what this little guy can do. And of course, he calls up Murat, who's a cavalry officer, and you think they're going to do whatever they do with any kind of riots. They're going to use minimum force, and they're going to bring in the horses, and they're going to march the horses down the street, and everybody's going to go home. No, Bonaparte is an artilleryman, and so he is going to bring in the artillery and use grape shot and other things and put down the crowd by annihilating huge chunks of Parisian streets as cannon fodder. And not only will these streets be damaged, but the people on them will definitely stop rioting because I put down a revolt with a whiff of grape shot, one of his more famous phrases. smell probably was, I imagine the smoke was hanging pretty dense in Paris for a while, and the streets ultimately went quiet. Now, two things about that. One, it's a horrible way to put down civil unrest, but it kind of made him a celebrity. I thought, well, what a guy. And this guy didn't mess around. You didn't tell him how to put down a crowd, you just told him to put down a crowd, so he did. Wow, don't mess with this little guy. He's kind of tough. And that's going to lead him off to Egypt. And his whole thing with Josephine, he's going to fall in love and marry her very quickly. She was the mistress of one of the other directors. And he's going to adopt the child. Ultimately, give him a really nice little stint when he eats Europe later. And he's going to head to Egypt and do extraordinary things and come back as a hero. And he's going to come back before his army, because his army suffered horribly in the Middle East. And that was because of the old British Navy sticking a finger in their eye again, not letting them get their supplies. So we are now in a position in 1799 where Napoleon comes back to Paris. He's returning as a hero. The directory has become so corrupt that he is at first called a traitor, and then ultimately a hero, and he has a fake fainting spell, and recovers himself quite nicely, gives a very nice speech, and brings in the central component of his army to basically take over the directory. So that is a coup d'etat de Vermeer, and one of the directors had kind of conspired with him, and that was, I can't remember his name right now, but he thought that he was going to be the man, and of course Napoleon will refer to this government as a consulate and proclaim himself first consul before the other guy could. Very, very shrewd and swift move, and they didn't anticipate Napoleon having a political side to him, but they have misjudged him badly. So, let me not misjudge you badly. Let's take 5 minutes, get a break, get a little water, get a little whatever you need, and we'll go to 1800, 1850. I'm going to be back. I promised to truncate this and be pretty brief, because you can see that 1800, 1850, well, it's Napoleon. Complete shift in Europe, and then we'll get to the Congress of Vienna, the attempt to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, the restoration of the balance of power, and that we call post-Napoleonic Europe, and then we have the year of revolution, 1848, very popular topic. So we'll get into that a little bit. Okay? So the part of the French Revolution, try to think of the French Revolution in two pieces, okay? 1789, 1799, 10 years, nice and clean, French Revolution. Now we're in a Napoleonic Europe. Is it still the French Revolution, or is it not the French Revolution? Yeah, I like that. Yeah, because there's aspects of both. It's still the French Revolution because Bonaparte, first of all, is the product of the French Revolution. He would have never gotten to where he was if it were not for the French Revolution and the French doing promotion by merit, levée en masse, and all that other stuff. So he is the quintessential child of the French Revolution, just like Frederick the Great is a quintessential child of the Enlightenment. So we can use that as a way to help strengthen our understanding of the French Revolution. But now we have something different. We still have that kind of wavering, because the ideas that Bonaparte has are also revolutionary. People across Europe, as they're going to be conquered by the French, are going to accept plebiscite for the first time ever. And new ways of thinking about how men should be governed. So, yes, but we also know there's another side to this, and that is that over time, as Napoleon goes on, as we get to 1808, 1809, 1810, it starts to look a lot more like a dictatorship. Now, an enlightened dictatorship, a benevolent dictatorship in some places, but it's still a dictatorship. And there isn't a whole lot of real dynamic republicanism or democracy happening. Okay, so that's kind of an important piece. Okay, so we want to think about that, and that's kind of the big overarching thing. Is this, in fact, a continuation, or is it something different? And I'll let you decide. You can argue it either way, but distinctly different. We're not going to have all kinds of changing governments. You're not going to sit there and think, now, was that the Legislative Assembly, the National Assembly? Was it the Directory? Was it the... No. It's just going to be Napoleon. Okay? Yes, when he takes over in 1799, it's a consulate for a while. By 1803, he is Emperor Napoleon I. And remember, that was his conquered out of the church. He solidified power by 1804. You've got the fancy, royal portrait with, you know, the Caesarean gold laurel wreath and the Roman eagle on the floor and his great portrait. We think of him as like, okay, now he is Emperor Napoleon the First. He has replaced the Bourbon as the dynasty, and now it is the Bonaparte dynasty. He resides in Versailles, and he's only there for a little while because he's got to go out and start fighting. Still extraordinary in that these are the things that you look at the great man theory in history, and this guy pops up to the top of the list just because he did some things that many of us can't do. Okay, even if you've come through Wellington's EPP program and you've been told that you're absolutely wonderful in every way, there are limits. And when you think about a guy who can rewrite over 1,000 years of law code by carrying 6 complete thoughts in his head at one time, that's something that not everybody's going to do. Okay? Go ahead and compose 6 different thoughts in your head at one time and then dictate it to somebody else sentence by sentence by sentence by sentence by sentence. That's not easy. This is the guy who's going to move an army of 800,000 men on the top of his head, and when he locates that poor colonel who's lost and cannot do land navigation at all, and he's trundling through the Belgian Low Countries, and he can't find anything, and who, of course, rides over the little rise in his white charger but Napoleon himself to ask this guy, where are you, and who are you, and who's your commanding general, and why are you here? You're not supposed to be here. Oh, my emperor, I'm with Dumouriez, I am so-and-so. And he says, oh, well, if you're with him, then you need to set your drum to this cadence and set your compass to this mark, and you'll be with him in 14 hours, and don't let me ever see you again so far out of position. Huh? How do you do that? I mean, the guy's a garment, long before it ever happened. So, yeah, is he extraordinary? Yeah. Like my good friend John Jordan, though, he sucked at chess. So it doesn't always translate. And Napoleon got extraordinarily frustrated and used to cheat at chess because it just pissed him off to no end. Here's the greatest strategic mind probably in 1,000 years, and he's just getting ripped on a chessboard with a 5-year-old. So anyway, the things that make this guy unique, of course, politically, and the one thing that always stands out is the Napoleonic Code. Even though the Napoleonic Code is downright abusive to females, it is considered the standard. Not the whole law code, but it's still the standard European law code today. Throughout Germany, throughout Austria, throughout France, Belgium, Netherlands, they still rely on the Napoleonic Code. So that's his lasting legacy. That's his big deal. But when you look at all that stuff, I think it's safe to say Napoleon was pretty bored. I don't think he really liked the political side of being Napoleon. I think that his more comfortable place was somewhere out in some field, sleeping in a field tent and knocking the dew off of his uniform in the morning and going out. That's what he preferred. He will have an ongoing hate relationship with the British. He refers to Great Britain as the island of shopkeepers. There is no one that he despises more. And it is much to his disappointment when he learns in 1805, as he's starting to string together some of the most impressive land battles of all time, he's going to learn that his navy has been humiliated by the British at Trafalgar, and his hopes of ever attacking the island of Britannia are dashed. And so he has to kind of work through that bitter pill. By the way, he almost wasn't a naval officer. He was actually going to go into the Navy because that's the better gunnery side of the French of any army, actually. The naval gunners are always going to be better than the army gunners because they're on an unstable platform and they're always going to work on their firing solutions a lot harder. But he decided on his own to go into the army. Boy, is that a good move, at least for the French and for him. But he was extraordinarily frustrated because he had humiliated the Austrian army at Ulm, one of my favorite German cities, birthplace of Kepler and Einstein. That's where if you remember, he surrendered his sword to General Mack surrendered his sword to him, and he gave it back to him, and then he went back to Vienna, and they put Mack in jail for like 3 years. Bizarre. He's probably Austria's finest commander, and they threw him in jail. French, because of course there was that stereotype, and we have to dash that right away, right? The French can't fight. Yeah, French can't fight. No, well, Europe is about to find out that the French can fight under Napoleon. They'll never get into any tactical stuff, so I'm not going to bother you talking about any of his tactical stuff, because I'd have you here till midnight. So we'll just go right to it and just explain that after he realizes the bitter pill of not being able to conquest all of Europe, he goes about basically redrawing the map of the rest of Europe. He secures the Low Countries and the Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg, and then he goes in and he humiliates the Austrians at Austerlitz, which is considered his greatest victory. Then he does something kind of interesting. He destroys the Austrian army at Austerlitz. He requires the Russians are going to flee. About 25,000 of them are going to get away. He's going to capture just incredible success there. But then he takes a page right out of Alexander's playbook. Right after Alexander, remember when Alexander captured the royal family of Darius at Issus, he turns around and he proposes marriage to the eldest daughter and completely wins over Darius' wife. And here comes Napoleon. He's absolutely humiliated the Austrians. He goes to Vienna. He stops short of the city with his French army. They don't come in as occupiers. They come in parade formation, and he accepts the keys to the city, and he divorces Josephine, and he betroths and then marries Marie Louise, a Habsburg beauty. Yeah, right. Does anyone remember why he divorced Josephine? By the way, the last words he says before he dies on St. Helena in 1821. Josephine.
Political reasons, right? She couldn't give him a child, a boy.
She couldn't give him a child, and because she was a mistress prior and Harry had a child, he thought, I'm being retorted. I'll be PG. I'll be kind of good. Okay. But typical Frenchman, okay, he is, the term used in European history is Napoleon was very liberal with his seed. Okay? So he's acting like Bill Clinton across the European countryside. But he gets word that she may have been indiscreet in Paris while he's gone, and she fell from a balcony, and that's why she couldn't give him a child. She had sustained an abdominal injury, and he gets word that she may have been indiscreet while he was out populating the entire countryside of Europe. So anyway, he divorces her, which is interesting, Catholic boy getting divorced. But he divorces her and marries Marie Louise, and they have a baby boy. They have a son, and he's going to name him, of course, Napoleon, Emperor of Romans. He gives him the title of Charlemagne. So no small ego in that family. Almost like George Foreman. Anyway, the success continues throughout the early 1800s, of course, until he decides that he can't strike England directly, so he's going to strike England indirectly. And I never have read anybody. David Chandler is the best English going to strike England indirectly, and I never have read anybody. David Chandler is the best English source writer on Napoleon, but there's a new book that's come out. I really want to get it because I'd like to find out if anybody has come up with the idea of whoever thought of the continental system. Did Napoleon come up with that on his own? Or did somebody say, Emperor, I have an idea. We could really hurt the British with it. Oh, I'm all ears. Let's not let them in any port. Okay, let's really make them mad so that they can put a complete embargo and blockade the entire continent, which is what the British Navy did. So he imposes the continental system. The continental system is a disaster because while it does hurt the British some, and certainly cutting off their markets in Europe, it hurts the rest of Europe a whole lot worse. Especially if you're in the wine industry and all cork is made in Portugal, and you've got the Italian wine industry, which would be a simple little boat trip across the Med, and now you've got to go over the Pyrenees. And you've got to go through the Alps Pass, and you've got to go back down into northern Italy. It's just disaster. So it's a big problem. Remember, we don't have rail transport yet. So no rail, no internal combustion engine. We're still doing horses and donkeys and things like that. This is a disaster. And this really, really harms the economy that Napoleon is powerless to do much with, including, of course, the reality is that if it's bad everywhere else, it's always going to be worse for the Russians. There's like your European history guaranteed. You think everybody's suffering? You gotta see what's going on in Russia. You think it's bad here. It's always that case because the capital of St. Petersburg, while a beautiful city, is icebound 5 to 6 months of the year. So trade is really important to the Russians. When that port melts in May, man, they want to get the ships in and out as much as they possibly can. And then you got Napoleon saying, no. And that's what really put the hardship onto the Russians where Tsar Alexander I is saying, look, my people are starving. You know, I'm sorry, my emperor, yes, you are great and powerful, but we're getting out of the continental system. And of course, that just screwed Napoleon in the ceiling. And that meeting at Königsberg, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall. They're going to go into Russia and they're going to just let them have it. March north onto St. Petersburg, end this thing real quickly, and they get into Russia and nobody's there. Now what the heck? Oh, we've made contact. Okay, good, we made contact. How are these people going to give up all their territory? They wouldn't do that. Well, you realize if you're Napoleon, you can't do anything. It's the first time ever that the terms are being dictated to Napoleon. Once you attack Russia, you're no longer in control. They are in control. And their two greatest generals are about to wreak havoc on the French Grand Army. What are those two great generals, Tom?
Winter and distance.
Yeah, winter and distance. So the Russians begin to scorch the earth. They burn that 150-mile path, 75 miles in each direction, in front of the Grand Army. He wants to go to St. Petersburg, but he knows he can't because as soon as he turns to go north, he's going to expose his right flank to Russian counterattack. So the Russian army's there, it's there. He's got to pursue the Russian army, pursue the Russian army, pursue the Russian deeper and deeper and deeper into Russia. And Russia in June is kind of like Ohio in June. It's hot and the mosquito is the national bird, and it's not very ideal. But the only difference is that we have a beautiful autumn in Ohio, and they have like 6 hours of autumn, and it goes right into winter. Yeah. So anyway, their lines get stretched further and further and further. I think the distance from Königsberg to Moscow is about like a little bit further than from here to St. Louis on foot. Not very comfy. Not very great. So, oh yeah, by the way, they're also poisoning the wells so they don't have drinking water. And let's see, in the summer, how much water are you going to probably drink in June when you're outside all day in a wool uniform, carrying about 40 to 50 pounds worth of crap, not to mention water. How many gallons are you going to go through it? Probably 2? And how about if you're in a cavalry unit? I don't even know what a horsey will drink in a day of drinking water, but it's got to be just extraordinary amounts of water. Just getting water to your army. That's not counting until October, and they're gonna fight at Borodino, and Napoleon is like, this is it, finally. And lo and behold, the Russian army puts up a heck of a fight, and Napoleon batters away at him, and he causes a whole bunch of damage. But for some reason, and I'll never figure out why, Napoleon didn't listen to his underlings, which he always did in all the battles. They said, hey, if we go around that way, if we're going to attack in the middle, we're going to pound them in the middle. That's where they're the weakest. And yeah, it didn't work out so well because all that entire exercise was an attempt to basically pin his army and get him to the position where they would only delay long enough for the people of Moscow to burn the city. That's all it was. Just going to burn the city down. And they did. And Napoleon thought he was going to do Vienna again. He thought he'd already prepared a speech. He thought he was going to get the keys to the city and everything was going to be great. His men are going to do a little R&R in Moscow. And then next spring, when the snows melt, which will be May, that's spring in Russia, it's May 1st and May 2nd. And then they go north. No. City's burned out. The roofs are wide open. There's no food. Moscow's kind of like Cleveland in the winter. If you've been to Cleveland in the winter, you're ready for Moscow. Because some days you go, hey, city. This is really nice. And then the next thing you know, about 5 minutes later, that wind blows in off the lake, and you go, wow, temperature's dropped 25 degrees in the last 5 minutes. So that's kind of the way Moscow is. It's kind of rough. It's kind of unhospitable. So and to make it worse, the Russians were coming in, setting fires. Long story short is Napoleon decides, we're going home. And they're going to retreat. So they're going to retreat to the south, and that was disaster, absolute disaster. Yeah. So he went in with about 750,000 men, and he gets out with around 40,000. Fights one battle, technically wins. That's why we say generals winter and distance. Hitler didn't learn a thing. Germans will do the same thing here in World War II. So that's the beginning of the end. The reason I take time on that story is because that is really when it ends and it all starts to unravel for Napoleon. And once that happens, then he's on the chase. He's going to get, by the way, he's going to get more men. They're going to fight at Leipzig in 1813, at the Battle of Nations in July of 1813. Never been to that battlefield. Love to go someday and see what that's like, because there's supposed to be a big monument there. And all the nations, even the Swedes, are going to be fighting him there. Everybody, the Austrians are going to turn on him. The Prussians are going to come back together and put their army back together after their humiliating loss at Auerstadt. And everybody's fighting Napoleon. And he fights and he fights and he fights and he fights all the way back into France. And you know what's interesting? They still want to negotiate with the guy. Even when he's in a defensive posture, even when they've had, 15 years to study his tactics, he's still inflicting heavy damage on all these European armies, and they want to negotiate with him. And it's amazing how the ego gets in the way of so many of these leaders, like Lee, like Hitler, like Napoleon. They keep looking for this one big battle that's going to turn everything back around. They're going to make one big change, and that's going to reverse their fortunes, and they'll be back winning again. And there's no way it's going to happen. So this thing continues to cascade until finally in 1814, he's back into Paris. He sues for peace. He's forced to sign a document, and they stick him on Elba Island, which is ridiculous. They stick him on Elba. He'd been the sovereign of Europe, now he's the sovereign of Elba. The problem is, of course, Elba is just too close. So he gets back. Did he swim? We don't know. Kickboard? Does he walk on water? We don't know. But we know he got back. He's welcomed in Paris as a hero. Louis XVIII is kind of doing the big eye roll, like, you gotta be kidding me. So he's going to leave. He's going to flee to Verona. And he's going to try it again. And that's when he's going to marshal all of his guys. And now he's going to go to Waterloo and be finally, completely, and totally destroyed, humiliated, defeated by an Irishman named Wellington and a homicidal Prussian named Blucher. And they'll put an end to Napoleon, or he'll go off into the middle of the Atlantic at St. Helena and spend the rest of his days there in the middle of the South Atlantic, drinking South African white wine and dying of stomach ulcer, stomach cancer. They exhumed his body and found a quarter-sized hole in his stomach. They did find trace arsenic too, so they still like that conspiracy the British were slowly poisoning him. So anyway, he's dead in 1821. What's left? The Congress of Vienna has a horrible job, and they did pretty well because they're going to try to redraw the map of Europe. They're going to try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. The problem that they can't overcome at the Congress of Vienna, it's not about redrawing the map. They did a good job with that. The problem is nationalism. That's what you can't get rid of. That's a hard thing to get rid of. And that's what Napoleon brought to Europe. That's the hard piece. And that's why you can do some cool things with the Congress of Vienna. Because the Congress of Vienna, remember, keep it simple, okay? Congress of Vienna, balance of power. Congress of Vienna, balance of power. Maintain status quo. Let's go back to the way things used to be. Let's pretend that Napoleon never happened. Let's go back to the old royal families and the Hohenzollerns and the Habsburgs and the Bourbon will be back on the throne. And Napoleon never happened. Except he kind of never really dealt with it. They just any nationalism as it came up, except for the Greeks, because they were revolting against the Turks, and that was okay. But other than that, they pretty much didn't like anybody. They just wanted everything to go on the way it used to be, and that was difficult to do. So here's the cool thing. If you get an essay question on that peace process, remember you've got an interval. The Congress of Vienna is 1815, and World War I is 1914, and you can write pretty convincingly that the Congress of Vienna did an outstanding job of maintaining peace, restoring the status quo, and trying to keep a balanced power, because we've got about 100 years where there's no real big knockdown, drag-out war. And it's a time of incredible prosperity, because that's when the Industrial Revolution really gets cranked. And the German economy cranks up. Oh, did I say Germany? Uh-oh, forgot that one, right? Well, yeah, Germany becomes a nation in that period. Italy becomes a modern nation in that period, and we've got problems, but you could make a powerful argument and say, for 99 years, if you're a math person, I'm a history guy, so I did 100 years, but you get the idea. For almost a century, the Congress of Vienna did what it wanted to do, did what it was basically set out to do. Problem is 1848. 1848 is the problem. And I'll say Italy and Germany and the Crimean War and all that stuff for the next time we meet. But 1848 is the year that everything kind of, the wheels came off. And no one really knows why. We know that it started in France, and it kind of trickled out like the rock hitting upon the waves going out across Europe. But we know that there was a big, big economic problem in France. We know that France had some major problems in February of 1848. And they didn't know how to resolve it, but ultimately they came up with this idea of trying socialism. And it's interesting because the King of France was really a popular guy. Remember Louis Philippe, the citizen king? He chose not to be Louis the 19th. He was a Bourbon. He could have easily been Louis the 19th. Instead, he was Louis Philippe, the citizen king. He was very, very much liked by the people, but ultimately, it's the economy, stupid. That was one of Bill Clinton's favorite things. That's the economy, stupid. And that's the reality of it. Things got so bad by January of 1848 that they had no other choice. Louis Philippe, citizen king, lost all his credibility, and he was forced from power. Louis Blanc becomes his replacement, who's extraordinarily popular because he has this idea of national workshops, creating jobs for people who don't have them. Government creating jobs. The only thing he forgot, the detail is that the government also has to pay for those jobs, which once they tried to do that and it didn't succeed, everybody's checks bounced, and Louis Blanc also bounced right out of power. And that led to the Bloody June days, and that led to their election, and who'd they elect?
Louis Napoleon.
Yeah, the one guy that was a criminal that had no background at all, but he had the best name recognition for any French politician. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Landslide over the other four. Never really knew anything about him, but they liked his name. So, okay, the rest of Europe is all about March. I call it March Madness. Okay, Vienna was the first one to go. After France. France, it started in France, but Vienna is the key because, of course, Vienna is the seat of the Holy Roman Empire. It's the seat of the Habsburg power. There was also a Frankfurt revolt. The Hohenzollern were a little bit smarter, but we know that Metternich was driven out of power. He leaves, and it was you guys. It was citizens, students, and city workers that started the Vienna revolt in 1848, and it was successful. And they started to write a constitution until this young guy by the name of Franz Joseph, who I think is 18 years old, he asserts himself, gets control of the army. That's that. Meanwhile, while those students and those city workers are taking over Vienna, it's like the cats that weigh, the mice will play. Things in Prague. The Bohemians are always looking to get freedom any way they can. Bohemia goes belly up, and they start writing a constitution, and they reinsert Czech as their dominant language, and lots of cool things happen there for a while. The great leader, Louis Kossuth, Louis Koch, if you know our assistant principal, Mrs. King, who's Hungarian. He starts a revolt in Hungary, and that's going to be the most lasting one. And of course, let's not forget the Sardinians. What did the Sardinians do?
Declared war on Austria.
They declared war on Austria. What a mistake. Costa Rica declaring war on us. Don't do it. they declare war on Austria, and within, by June, they're going to be completely smashed and licking their wounds. Prague will be reclaimed, and it looked like everything was going back to normal except for Budapest. And the Austrians threw everything that they could at Louis Kossuth and the Hungarians, held tough and stuffed them. And the only way that Hungary lost its independence was what? The Russians. Right, the Russians. The old Holy Alliance, which is just a handshake agreement from the Congress of Vienna, never met, never did anything. That was Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Handshake agreement. The Russians decide. It's Nicholas I. He says, well, if my dad said it's okay, my dad was Alexander I, my dad defeated Napoleon, by gosh, I'm going to honor my dad, filial piety all the way. We're going. They march 100,000 Russian soldiers to Budapest, and the Russians are going to capture and kill Louis Kossuth, and the Hungarians will never forgive the Russians for that. Even worse than the Holocaust. Hungarians hate the Russians. And so, at the close of 1848, the Congress of Vienna is still hanging tough. Questions?